The first box broke open when the water reached the courthouse steps, seeping down into a basement no one remembered sealing. Mud stained the stone walls, and the air carried the smell of rust and wet paper. By lantern light, clerks began pulling ruined tax ledgers from collapsed shelves, until one crate surfaced intact, wrapped in oilcloth and bound with wire. On its lid, written in a careful, almost tender hand, was a name no one in that county liked to hear spoken aloud. Marie Jackson. The records inside were dry, preserved too well for their age, pages yellowed but firm as if they had been handled recently. There were hospital intake forms signed by doctors long dead, baptismal records for children never found in any census, and journals written in alternating inks, some so faded they looked like bruises beneath the words. Dates stretched back before the Civil War and ended abruptly in 1912, the year Marie Jackson supposedly vanished into the mountains. What unsettled the clerks most was the order of it all. Tragedies were catalogued before they occurred. A mining collapse was detailed 3 months early. A family fire was listed with names crossed out in red, as though corrected after the fact. Maps showed hollows that did not exist anymore, marked with circles and notes warning not to dig, not to listen, not to follow voices after dusk. When word spread, the town changed its posture. Doors closed. Church bells rang at odd hours. Older residents refused to walk past the courthouse, spitting at the ground as if to ward something off. They said Marie Jackson had been a recorder, not of history, but of debts the land collected slowly. By the time the state archivist arrived, sleep had already thinned in the valley. He read until his hands shook, until he swore the pages whispered when turned, until he realized some of the handwriting at the end matched his own. And deep in the final journal, beneath a date labeled simply 1947, a single line waited patiently, as if it had always known who would find it next. In the spring of 1947, the rain did not fall like weather but like intent, steady and unrelenting, soaking the Appalachian hills until the earth itself seemed to soften and sigh. For 3 days the clouds pressed low against the mountains, emptying themselves into creeks that had not overflowed in a generation. By the 4th night, the courthouse steps in the small county town were slick with muddy water, the kind that carried twigs, dead leaves, and things no one wanted to look at too closely. The building had stood since the 1880s, its foundation sunk deep into rock, its basement long ignored, used only as a place to forget what no longer fit upstairs. When the floodwaters finally breached the lower door, no alarm was raised. It was assumed the water would recede as it always had, leaving behind nothing worse than damp ledgers and warped furniture. But the basement had been sealed off decades earlier, quietly and without record, its original entrance bricked over after a series of unexplained losses that were never officially documented. As the water rose, it loosened mortar already weakened by time, prying apart stones with slow patience. By morning, a section of the wall had collapsed inward, revealing a narrow storage room no living clerk had ever entered. The air that escaped carried a smell unlike rot or mold. It was dry, metallic, and old, as though the room had been holding its breath. Lanterns were brought down, their weak light cutting across shelves stacked with crates wrapped in oilcloth, each bound with wire so rusted it flaked at a touch. Most bore no labels. Some had dates scratched out. One sat apart from the others, elevated on a wooden pallet, untouched by the water that pooled around it, as if the flood itself had curved away. When the wire was cut, it snapped sharply, echoing too loudly in the confined space. Inside were documents packed with unnatural care, papers aligned perfectly, edges uncurled, ink still dark. It was immediately clear these were not tax records or property deeds. Names appeared repeatedly, always followed by annotations, symbols in the margins, and dates that did not always move forward. At the top of the first ledger, written in a precise, deliberate hand, was a title that made the clerk hesitate before reading it aloud. No one present could later explain why the room had been sealed, who ordered it, or why these records had been hidden instead of destroyed, only that as the water continued to rise around their boots, a quiet certainty settled in the basement that the discovery had not been accidental, that the flood had not merely exposed forgotten shelves but had arrived at the exact moment the mountain itself decided to return something it had been keeping for a very long time. Once the first ledger was lifted from the crate, the others followed with uneasy precision, as though their weight demanded acknowledgement. The label Marie Jackson appeared not just once but everywhere, written on folder spines, stamped into medical intake cards, and embossed faintly onto the covers of journals whose leather had darkened with age. The handwriting never varied. Whether dated 1843 or 1909, the letters remained sharp and controlled, giving no indication that decades had passed between entries. This alone unsettled the clerks, who were accustomed to seeing records decay along with the hands that made them. The contents defied any single purpose. Hospital ledgers listed patients admitted for ailments that made little sense when read aloud, conditions described in terms of absence rather than injury, such as missing breath, misplaced shadows, or delayed heartbeats. Some names were followed by small crosses, others by circles broken at the top, symbols that repeated across dozens of pages without explanation. Birth records were meticulous yet disturbing, noting not only dates and parentage but also the precise hour a child first cried and the direction it faced when lifted from the ground. Tucked between official documents were journals filled with observations written in alternating inks. One voice was clinical, recording weather patterns, soil conditions, and unusual sounds carried through the hollows at night. The other was intimate, almost confessional, describing dreams that bled into waking life and encounters with people who insisted they had already died. Maps were folded into the bindings, hand-drawn with careful shading, marking ridgelines, sinkholes, and abandoned paths that did not appear on any county survey. In the margins were warnings written smaller than the rest, urging the reader not to trust echoes, not to follow names called from below, and never to return something once it had been buried properly. As the clerks continued sorting, they noticed an order that went beyond chronology. Certain families appeared again and again across different types of records, their names resurfacing after long gaps, always in connection with loss. A mining accident in one ledger corresponded to a baptism entry 3 years later, as though the event had created something that required naming. Death certificates were often unsigned, yet appended with notes that suggested the cause had been expected rather than investigated. The most unsettling discovery came near the bottom of the crate, where a bundle of loose pages had been tied together with red thread. These were lists, written without context, each line a name followed by a date and a short phrase such as kept, returned, or still owed. The final page in the bundle was blank except for a single sentence written with deliberate restraint, stating that the records were complete only when read by the right eyes, and that until then, they would remain patient, waiting in the dark where the mountain could remember them better than any living witness. The Jackson name moved through the town faster than the floodwater ever had, carried in half-finished sentences and glances that ended conversations the moment an outsider stepped close. Clerks who mentioned it in the general store were met with sudden silence, the scrape of chairs on wooden floors, and the unmistakable sense that they had crossed an invisible line. Older residents who had lived their entire lives in the valley stiffened at the sound of it, their expressions tightening not with confusion but with recognition, as though something long asleep had been nudged awake. When questions were asked, answers dissolved into evasions. Some claimed they had never known a Marie Jackson, insisting the name must belong to another county, another ridge, another mistake made by paperwork. Others admitted they had heard it once, long ago, but could not remember from whom or in what context. The more the clerks pressed, the more erratic the responses became. A shopkeeper closed early and nailed a horseshoe above his door. A preacher cancelled evening services without explanation, later saying only that some things should not be spoken after sundown. It became clear that curiosity was not the emotion the name provoked. It was fear, but not the loud, immediate kind. It was practiced fear, worn smooth by repetition, passed down in gestures rather than stories. Mothers pulled children closer when the courthouse bell rang. Men who prided themselves on knowing every hollow and trail suddenly claimed unfamiliarity with places marked on the maps. When one clerk asked an elderly woman if she had ever known a Jackson, she stared at him for a long moment before whispering that names like that were given to keep things from wandering, not to explain them. Rumors began to surface in fragments, never complete enough to form a whole. Some said Marie Jackson had been a midwife who recorded more than births. Others claimed she worked with the sick and the dying, writing down what followed them home. A few insisted she had never been a single person at all, but a title carried by those who agreed to listen when the mountains spoke back. Each version ended the same way, with the speaker abruptly changing the subject or walking away as though the ground beneath their feet had shifted. The hostility grew sharper when word spread that the records were being catalogued. Town elders arrived at the courthouse unannounced, demanding to see what had been found. Their concern was not about accuracy or ownership but containment. They warned that some knowledge did not belong in public hands, that the mountains had their own ways of settling accounts, and that stirring old names invited attention best avoided. One man, his hands shaking despite his stern voice, said the records were never meant to be read, only kept, because reading them aloud was how things started noticing you again. As the cataloguing continued despite local resistance, patterns began to surface with an unsettling clarity that no one had anticipated. What first appeared to be a disordered collection of unrelated documents slowly revealed an internal logic, one that ignored conventional timelines and instead followed a rhythm dictated by repetition and consequence. Clerks started cross-referencing names out of habit, then out of concern, and finally out of a growing sense that the records were arranging themselves to be understood in a particular way. Unexplained deaths recorded in hospital ledgers aligned with missing person reports filed years later under different circumstances. A man listed as having died from a sudden collapse appeared again in a school register as absent without explanation, his name eventually crossed out not with the neat line of bureaucracy but with heavy ink, as though struck in anger. Children who vanished without trace resurfaced in land deeds, their names embedded in property transfers that followed tragedies rather than sales. In several cases, a family would lose a child, only to acquire a previously inaccessible stretch of land months later, the transaction justified by obscure legal language that no modern clerk could fully interpret. The journals provided the connective tissue. Marie's observations often preceded the events they seemed to describe, noting shifts in animal behavior, changes in water taste, or a sense of pressure in certain hollows. These entries were followed, sometimes decades later, by official documents confirming disasters in those exact locations. A cave-in occurred where she had warned the ground was thinning. A house fire erupted on a night she had marked with a symbol used nowhere else in the journals. The implication was not that she predicted these events, but that she had been recording the terms under which they would occur. Land disputes formed another disturbing pattern. Families who resisted selling property in areas marked on Marie's maps often experienced a sequence of misfortunes that forced their compliance. Livestock died suddenly. Wells ran dry. Accidents accumulated with improbable frequency. When the land finally changed hands, the suffering ceased, and the new owners were often those whose names appeared earlier in the journals, sometimes listed under headings that suggested stewardship rather than ownership. What disturbed the clerks most was the sense of exchange running through every pattern. Nothing happened in isolation. Each loss seemed to balance a gain elsewhere, each disappearance coinciding with stability in another part of the valley. Even deaths were followed by notations implying resolution, as if an account had been settled. The records did not mourn. They reconciled. As these connections grew undeniable, a quiet dread settled over the courthouse. The idea that generations of Appalachian tragedies might be linked not by chance or cruelty but by an invisible ledger was too large to confront directly. The mountains were no longer passive backdrops to human suffering, they were active participants, enforcing agreements no one alive remembered making, and Marie Jackson's records stood as the only surviving proof that the valley's history had never been random, only carefully, patiently managed. The deeper the clerks read, the harder it became to dismiss the most troubling implication woven through the records. Marie Jackson appeared to know what was coming. Dates were not merely recorded after the fact but placed with intention, often accompanied by language that assumed an outcome before it occurred. A journal entry dated weeks before a fatal landslide spoke calmly of ground that had already given up its hold, despite no visible signs of instability at the time. Another entry described a child's absence from a future census years before the child was born, the line written with the same unhurried certainty as the weather notes that surrounded it. These were not vague predictions or superstitions. The specificity was what unnerved everyone who noticed it. Names were spelled correctly, locations exact, outcomes unambiguous. In one case, Marie listed the date and hour of a mine collapse, noting how many men would be present underground and which families would be affected longer than others. When the actual disaster report was found decades later, every detail matched, including a final note about a single survivor whose name had been underlined twice in the journal. There was no indication anywhere that the entry had been altered after the fact. The ink had aged uniformly, the paper undisturbed. Some entries suggested revisions, but even these followed a pattern. Events were crossed out and rewritten, not because they failed to happen, but because their shape had changed. A death became a disappearance. A fire became a sickness. The result was always the same, but the path shifted, as if circumstances were flexible so long as the final balance was achieved. This raised a question no one wanted to voice, whether the records were describing the future or negotiating it. The language Marie used reinforced the discomfort. She rarely expressed surprise. Instead, she wrote of waiting, preparing, and marking when something was ready. Her tone implied participation rather than observation. In places, she addressed the records themselves, reminding them to remain patient and to accept delays without resistance. It was as though the pages were part of a process that extended beyond her own life, something she was maintaining rather than creating. One clerk, attempting to rationalize what they were seeing, suggested that the records might have been updated secretly over time. That explanation fell apart when an entry dated 1871 referenced a courthouse renovation that would not occur until 1898, described with architectural details that matched the building precisely. Another entry listed the names of officials involved in a future inquiry, including one clerk's grandfather, spelled incorrectly in a way only family members ever used. The growing realization was not simply that Marie Jackson foresaw events, but that the act of recording them may have been essential to their unfolding. The journals did not feel like warnings ignored or prophecies fulfilled. They read like instructions followed by something older and larger than the people whose lives were quietly shaped by dates written in ink long before their time arrived. The state archivist arrived with the authority of paper and seals, a man accustomed to decay and forgotten things, yet even he hesitated when the boxes were brought into the temporary records room. At first, his work followed routine. He wore gloves, logged conditions, photographed pages, and noted the unusual consistency of the ink. He dismissed the clerk's unease as local superstition, the kind that grew easily in isolated places. But as the hours passed, his posture changed. He leaned closer to the journals, rereading passages, tracing dates with his finger as if checking a pulse. By the second day, he stopped eating lunch. By the third, he refused to let anyone else handle certain volumes, insisting on reviewing them alone. It was then that he began to speak of the records as though they possessed intent. He remarked that some pages resisted turning, that others seemed warmer than the room, that the handwriting grew more familiar the longer he read. When a clerk laughed nervously, the archivist fixed him with a stare and said the documents were not passive, that they responded to attention the way wounds responded to pressure. His notes became erratic. Margins once filled with neat observations now carried cramped additions written sideways, phrases repeated and underlined until the paper thinned. He started arriving early and staying long after dusk, claiming the records were clearer at night. He complained of headaches and a ringing in his ears, describing it as a low sound like breath moving through tunnels. When asked to take a break, he snapped that stopping mid-process was dangerous, that unfinished readings left things unresolved. The illness came on quietly. His hands trembled when he tried to write, and his skin took on a grey pallor that no amount of rest corrected. He began to lose time, unable to recall entire afternoons, though his handwriting appeared in the logs during those missing hours. One morning, he was found slumped over a journal, whispering apologies to the page in front of him. When pressed, he claimed the records had corrected him, that he had misunderstood his role and needed to listen instead of classify. Before he was removed from duty, he confided in one clerk that the documents were layered, that reading too much too quickly caused a kind of overlap. He said events began to echo forward and backward, that names repeated themselves in his thoughts even when he was not looking at the pages. He warned that the journals were not meant to be consumed all at once, that they were designed to be absorbed slowly, across generations, to prevent exactly what was happening to him. When he was finally sent home, he left behind a final note written shakily on official letterhead, stating that the Marie Jackson records should not be centralized or summarized, because meaning emerged only when the reader was properly situated within them. 2 weeks later, he was hospitalized with no clear diagnosis, telling doctors that the records had answered back because he had asked the wrong questions, and that now something had learned his name and was waiting patiently for him to finish reading it. The elders came in the early morning, before the courthouse opened, moving with a quiet coordination that suggested long practice rather than sudden outrage. There were 6 of them, men and women whose families had held influence in the valley for generations, their authority rooted less in law than in continuity. They did not ask to see the records, they demanded them, insisting that what had been uncovered was never meant to pass into official custody. Their voices were controlled, but their urgency betrayed a deeper fear, one sharpened by the archivist's collapse and the rumors spreading beyond the county. They claimed responsibility without explanation, saying only that their predecessors had been tasked with keeping certain things contained. The records, they argued, were not historical artifacts but safeguards, and removing them from their intended context endangered everyone. When a clerk questioned why such documents had been preserved at all, one elder replied that destruction was never an option, that burning created attention, and attention invited negotiation. The correct approach had always been storage, silence, and respect for boundaries set long before the current generation was born. Tension escalated when it became clear the elders intended to reclaim the documents permanently. They spoke of returning the journals to the mountain, using language that blurred the line between burial and offering. Several mentioned fire as a last resort, but only if the records had already been compromised. One woman, her hands marked by age and work, warned that incomplete destruction would be worse than none at all, that half-burned pages were how things escaped notice in the past. Their insistence that the records should never be read again rested on a shared belief that knowledge carried weight, and that weight attracted attention. They spoke of earlier attempts to interpret Marie Jackson's writings, each followed by periods of instability, illness, and loss. The records, they said, were not meant to inform but to hold something in place, like a seal or a boundary stone. Reading them aloud, copying them, or removing them from their original location weakened that function. When the county officials refused to surrender the documents, citing state authority, the elders' composure fractured. They warned that the valley had survived by honoring certain arrangements, by understanding that not every truth served the living. One elder admitted that the records had been used in the past to settle disputes quietly, to redirect harm away from the town as a whole, but only when guided by those who understood the cost. Without that guidance, the documents became unpredictable. As they left, one of them paused at the doorway and turned back, his voice barely above a whisper. He said the records were not archives but agreements, and agreements demanded caretakers, not readers. He warned that once the documents were fully removed from their place of keeping, the responsibility they represented would begin seeking new holders, and that the mountain had never been patient with those who inherited obligations without consent. As investigators began examining the records more closely, a disturbing realization emerged. The documents were not merely historical, they mapped a hidden network beneath the mountains, a system both physical and ritualistic that no modern survey had ever captured. At first, it was subtle. Hand-drawn maps included paths, ridges, and hollows that did not appear on official county charts, labeled with symbols that defied conventional understanding. Circles, triangles, and lines intersected in ways that suggested patterns beyond simple geography, and certain points were marked with annotations like listen, wait, or turn away, words that implied instruction rather than observation. The pattern became more pronounced when cross-referencing the maps with journal entries. Dates of local tragedies coincided with the locations marked in the margins. One ledger entry described a house fire with unusual specificity, noting the direction of the wind, the movement of smoke, and the sound of a bell-like chime carried across the hollow before the flames began. On the corresponding map, a symbol resembling an open eye hovered over that exact location. Investigators began to suspect that these markings were not only descriptive but functional, indicating places where human activity intersected with forces they could neither name nor fully measure. Physical anomalies reported in the journals confirmed the map's significance. Wells ran dry without cause, small sinkholes appeared suddenly, and animals avoided certain ridges as though sensing something imperceptible. Locals who had once dismissed such stories found themselves explaining missing livestock or eerie sounds that carried over valleys, phenomena that, according to the records, had been expected and catalogued for generations. It became clear that the Jackson records did more than recount events, they provided instructions for interacting with a hidden framework beneath the land, a lattice of influence linking topography to human behavior. As the investigators followed the patterns, they discovered references to ceremonies or rituals tied to these locations, often described in cryptic language. Entries suggested that offerings, silence, or careful observation were required at specific times, sometimes dictated by lunar phases or weather. These practices were recorded without overt moral judgment, presented instead as rules for survival or guidance to prevent misfortune. The journals implied that those who ignored the system suffered consequences, while those who adhered to it, even unknowingly, were shielded from its more destructive elements. By the time the full scope of the hidden system became apparent, unease had settled like a weight over the investigators. The records were no longer just documents, they were a map, a ledger, and a guide to forces embedded within the mountains themselves, shaping events and lives in ways that no living resident fully understood, and revealing a past that demanded attention not just for knowledge but for preservation and obedience. Once word of the Marie Jackson records reached neighboring towns, the fragile sense of isolation that had defined the Appalachian Valley began to fracture. Travelers spoke in hushed tones about the discovery, describing journals that seemed to anticipate events, maps that marked impossible paths, and symbols that carried a warning in every stroke. The rumors did not travel slowly, they arrived like a cold wind, slipping into every holler and hollow, carrying with them a sense of inevitability and dread. People who had once felt secure in their routines began to question what they had always taken for granted: the reliability of their surroundings, the safety of their homes, the silence of the mountains at night. As the news spread, paranoia grew in tangible ways. Families double-checked locks that had never needed securing, neighbors watched each other with new suspicion, and children were kept close to hearths long after dark. One town reported sudden, inexplicable illnesses, a rash of headaches and fevers striking individuals in households mentioned in passing as connected to the Jackson records. Another saw livestock vanish overnight, only to be found days later in unlikely places, injured or dead. These incidents were dismissed publicly as coincidence, but private whispers attributed them to attention drawn by the records, as if acknowledging their contents had awakened latent forces. Confessions began to surface, too, though rarely willingly. Individuals approached county officials, sometimes under cover of night, offering fragmentary recollections of old misdeeds, debts, or losses that had never been spoken aloud. Some claimed to have known of the Jackson system, of the rules, rituals, and boundaries noted in the journals, and admitted to breaking them, however inadvertently, over the years. Others came forward with stories of sudden disappearances, unexplained deaths, or strange sounds that had always been attributed to the wilderness. The common thread was an overwhelming sense that the records had drawn attention, that revealing even fragments of their content invoked consequences long dormant. Disappearances escalated quickly, alarming even the most stoic residents. People vanished from farms, from roads, and from their homes, often leaving belongings untouched, doors locked, and no indication of struggle. In several cases, the locations corresponded directly to sites identified in Marie Jackson's maps, particularly those marked with unusual symbols or annotated with cautionary notes. Investigators and locals alike began to notice patterns. Those who sought the records too aggressively or who spoke openly of them were disproportionately affected, while the quietly cautious remained untouched, though fearful. Communities that had once been self-contained began interacting in unusual ways, as if seeking collective protection against the unseen influence implied by the records. Meetings were held in secrecy, alliances formed and dissolved, and old rivalries were postponed for the sake of survival. The valley and its surroundings were no longer merely a collection of homes and hills, they had become a network of observers, participants, and potential victims in a system that Marie Jackson had codified decades before, a system that was now asserting itself with a quiet, inexorable pressure. By the time the gravity of the Marie Jackson records was fully recognized, the valley had begun to change in ways subtle and irreversible. The quiet isolation that had once defined the Appalachian hills was fractured, replaced by a tension that moved like a low fog through every hollow and along every ridge. People no longer took for granted the rhythm of day and night, the predictability of weather, or even the permanence of their own homes. The journals and maps, once hidden and patient, had awakened a tension that could not be soothed, and the mountains seemed to hum with a quiet insistence that everything written within those pages mattered far more than anyone alive could have imagined. Families became careful in ways that went beyond mere superstition. They avoided certain paths, refrained from discussing the records openly, and observed times of day and night with a newfound ritualistic precision. Entire households reframed their daily activities around places marked in the journals, even if the reasons were incomprehensible. The notion that Marie Jackson's records had once been dormant or passive became impossible to sustain. They were active now, shaping not only the behavior of those who read them but the environment itself. Wells ran dry in some hollows, winds shifted unpredictably, and distant echoes of voices carried across valleys where no one had been. Every anomaly was a reminder that the mountains had not been neutral observers, and neither were the records. The influence extended beyond immediate observation. Land disputes, previously settled quietly or legally, now carried the undertone of caution dictated by the journals. People hesitated before claiming or relinquishing property, aware that a single misstep might attract forces catalogued decades before. Small accidents and misfortunes, once considered coincidental, were now interpreted as part of a broader ledger, a balance that could tip according to adherence or neglect of the system Marie Jackson had left behind. What was extraordinary was not just the coincidence of events but the seeming intelligence behind their sequence, the sense that the valley itself had a memory and a mechanism for enforcement. Even those who avoided the records entirely felt their presence. The stories spread quietly, with names whispered in hallways, across church pews, and over fences. Outsiders entering the valley sensed the careful watchfulness in glances, the deliberate movement through spaces considered dangerous or forbidden. It became evident that the Jackson records had never been solely about recording events, they were about maintaining a balance, managing debts and attention over generations. And now that they had been rediscovered, that system no longer waited passively, it began to interact with those who lived within its scope, nudging, guiding, and, when necessary, correcting. By the close of the first year after their discovery, Appalachia was fundamentally altered. The mountains no longer felt like a backdrop to human life but like a ledger itself, responding to observation, to action, and to attention. People learned quickly that the records were not inert history, they were instructions, warnings, and judgments, quietly asserting that Marie Jackson's work had never ended with her death, and that the valley, the people, and the future itself were now entwined with a record that waited patiently and ceaselessly for the next movement to be made.